The idea was simple in theory. Track followed by spike followed by track. The same recursive pattern stretched across 3,000 miles of empty land. But while the Transcontinental Railroad looked deceptively simple on paper, it proved to be nearly impossible in reality. This groundbreaking innovation would require intense labor, ingenious new technologies, and unrelenting determination from all those involved. After 7 years of construction, the end result was an unparalleled feat of ingenuity that would forever unite the states of America. Amidst the sectionalism of the era, the railroad bound the fragile nation together, conquered the western frontier, and bolstered trade, but nevertheless triggered widespread racial discrimination towards Native Americans and Chinese immigrants. Since the early 1800s, the idea of a transcontinental railroad had captivated land-hungry Americans, fueled by the promise of manifest destiny. Before the railroad, travelers had only two routes to the Pacific: a grueling trek along the Oregon Trail or a lengthy voyage around the tip of South America. The growing nation needed an efficient and effective way to travel across the continent. The idea of the railroad captivated Theodore Judah, an engineer and surveyor. He became convinced that a railroad could reach Sacramento from the east, an idea that earned him the nickname Crazy Judah. Undaunted, Judah persuaded local Californian businessmen Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, Collis Huntington, and Charles Crocker to invest in his scheme and form the Central Pacific Railroad Company. The Big Four, as they were called, were widely ridiculed for this move. Critics asserted that it was impossible to build a single railroad across thousands of miles of uncharted territory, especially over a terrain as uneven and challenging as the American West. No one believed the idea would materialize. The monetary and physical obstacles were simply too great, not to speak of the political barriers. Indeed, the turbulent political atmosphere of the 1850s brought plans for a railroad to a grinding halt. Highly polarized by the debate over slavery, Congress was unable to agree on a suitable route across the country. In the North, Senator Stephen Douglas advocated a railroad that would push west through the upper half of the country. Southerners, spurred by Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, pressed for a route started in Texas, in hopes of opening the West to Southern influence and settlement, a euphemism for the spread of slavery. Unable to reconcile the differences, the federal government was paralyzed. Any attempt to choose a route would seem like a referendum on slavery, sure to draw the ire of the opposing region. But fortunes turned when the South seceded and the Civil War began. With the departure of the Southern delegates, Northern Republicans were free to create a transcontinental railroad in the North. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, which authorized the Central Pacific Railroad Company to begin construction in the West. It also formed a second corporation, the Union Pacific Railroad Company, that would build in the East. Furthermore, the act gave generous land grants to the companies and performance-based incentives designed to stimulate swift work. The government would offer $16,000 for every mile of track that the companies laid on flat ground, and doubled this rate in mountainous areas. This system promoted competition between the two rival companies, as each strove to lay more track than the other. Eager to outdo its competitor, the Union Pacific began construction in the East, but immediately ran into a problem. Surveyors faced stubborn resistance from Native Americans, who wisely foresaw that the march of the railroad would be a permanent threat to their existence.
The buffalo wouldn't go across the railroad tracks, and it started disrupting, the natural habitat of the Indians' environment.
From the other side of the country, the Central Pacific had its own difficulties. Iron needed for tracks was made exclusively on the East Coast, and without a transcontinental railroad, had to be shipped around the tip of South America. The 3-month journey often delayed construction. In addition, the shortage of laborers was a pressing problem, as the dangerous work deterred many able-bodied men. But even when the Central Pacific had ample supplies and labor, it was stymied by the Sierra Nevadas, which drastically slowed down construction. Overland routes were extremely impractical, and workers were forced to painstakingly blast tunnels through the hard granite. While the problem of supplies continually plagued the Central Pacific, the company found innovative solutions to the latter two problems. To deal with the labor shortage, the railroad hired Chinese immigrants, who would work for less money and were more compliant.
A lot of people said that the Chinese were not strong enough, they were not intelligent enough to do railroad work, but they could. Central Pacific was employing about 10,000 Chinese workers, definitely the backbone of the Central Pacific's labor force.
Soon, Chinese workers made up 80% of the Central Pacific's workforce, and the company quickly passed through the mountains. Meanwhile, a revitalized Union Pacific was storming toward the ocean. The race was now on to see which company could lay the most tracks and obtain the largest share of the government spoils. From each side of the country, company leaders pushed their workers and engineers to the limit. Finally, as the two railroads closed the distance between them, respective company executives decided on a meeting point, Promontory Point, near Council Bluffs, Utah. On May 10, 1869, Governor Leland Stanford triumphantly hammered in the Golden Spike, marking the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. What had started out as Theodore Judah's fanciful idea had finally become a reality. Everywhere, church bells tolled, and newspapers heralded the railroad as an innovation that would revolutionize the commerce of the world and link the destinies and interests of the East and West in one indissoluble bond. It would be regarded as a marvel of enterprise by all nations. It indicated the dawn of a new civilization. Newspapers were enthusiastically optimistic about the promise of the Transcontinental Railroad, and with good reason. In the short term, the Transcontinental Railroad established a national market, uniting the country through trade routes. Eastern corporations profited immensely with their newfound access to Western consumers. By 1880, the Transcontinental Railroad was shipping $50 million of freight every year. Eager settlers were provided with a quick means of transportation, and the Western population grew exponentially with the advent of the railroad. Towns that had sprung up during the construction of the railroad expanded with the flow of commerce and people, growing into vital hubs of trade. Aside from trade, the innovation also united the country intellectually, as ideas traveled rapidly from coast to coast. Telegraph lines along the path of the rail sparked a national exchange that fostered a common American culture, helping bridge the sectional divide that lingered in American society. This newfound unity extended only to the established America, a country dominated by white Anglo-Saxons. For the past 30 years, this country had been preoccupied with regional conflicts between the North and South. But as the Civil War ended and white settlers from all parts of the country traveled west on the railroad, they found common ground in their shared hostility towards Native Americans and other minorities. In this sense, the railroad actually magnified racism in the West. The concept of Native American lands in the West vanished, as white settlers established towns along the railroad line. As the mayor of Cheyenne, Wyoming declared to an approving crowd, "Here is the city of Cheyenne. May she ever prosper, and the tribe of Indians after whom she is named be completely exterminated." Native Americans were not the only group to experience the darker side of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Chinese, whose hard work had been invaluable to the railroad, found themselves discriminated against and persecuted by racist white settlers.
And the number of people migrating to California increased dramatically. So in a sense, the Chinese built the vehicle that would in part lead to their own exclusion.
However, many of them stayed and brought their families over. It generated a strong community through the Sacramento Valley area, San Francisco, and to this day they're still populating that area.
The idea of the Transcontinental Railroad truly embodied the America of the latter 19th century, a country that was ripe for change. For decades, America had been a house divided, sharply separated economically and socially. The Transcontinental Railroad was created to remedy this problem, as all innovations are born out of necessity. In this case, the innovation was not the railroad car, not the railroad tracks, not the technology of construction, but rather the sum of all these components fused into a single tangible entity. In its entirety, the railroad was an innovation that answered the call for unity among the American people on a scale that had never been attempted before. Its completion manifested the boundless enthusiasm of a young nation, eager to expand its horizons and move past the sectional politics that had defined the previous era. Though the first Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, others soon followed.
Hell, they copied it. You know, within a few years, there was another Transcontinental Railroad and then another. So it must have been a good idea because people kept copying the idea.
Though the first Transcontinental Railroad, conceived by the idealistic Theodore Judah, had been stained by prejudice and exploitation, and though its construction had been fraught with perils, the innovation ushered the country into an unparalleled era of new unity and prosperity, and ultimately united the states of America.